All right. So yeah, we're gonna. Thank you so much for the opening. So we're gonna start with members from the Otra Editorial Committee from Sexa Grietas del Norte. So yeah, like I said, my name is Corbin. I'm joined by Imwat, Kiki, and Roberto. And we're gonna start off with a little bit introduction of what is Sexa Grietas del Norte, why did we make a journal, talk about this journal, and end with like the process of how we made the journal. And then after that, we'll go into a few readings. So yeah, take it away, Roberto.
Okay, Corley Yoali, Notoka Roberto Hernandez. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. So I want to just share a little bit about how we came together as a network. First of all, Sexta Grietas del Norte is a network of both collectives and individuals that are adherents or adherentes to the Sixth Declaration of the Lacandona Jungle. So Sixth Declaration is a document that was written by Zapatistas that essentially was a call to extend rebellion and resistance internationally, right? And so one of the things that the Zapatistas stated in that document, among many others points, was that the best way to support them, right? Too often we're stuck in the solidarity mode where we're helping or being in solidarity with struggles elsewhere. So the best way to support us is for you to recognize the respective struggles in your own trincheras, in your own trenches, in your own geographies, and to take up those struggles there. And collectively, across different geographies, we have a joint struggle. That is the call of the Sexta. So in the spirit of the Sexta, we know many things happened over the 10 years after that document. There was at least 2 attempts to build national networks of and international networks in the U.S. of Zapatista adherents of the Sixth Declaration. Ours is essentially the 3rd major attempt to create such network, and by far, definitely been the most successful and long-lasting. Kiki earlier was reminding us that we're almost going on 5 years now from when we first got together. Now, in terms of that coming together of the network itself, it occurred through a very interesting process, which was initiated arguably not by us, but by the Zapatistas themselves. And that was in late spring, summer of 2017, where they wrote a very beautiful communique. And I say beautiful because if any of you have read any of the communiques from the Zapatistas, they're always very poetic. They're always very filled with layers and layers of symbolism and teachings. And in that first communique, which they called the first of many, they essentially, and I'm going to just paraphrase the story here, they essentially said, for years, since 94, many of you in the US have helped sustain us through support in various ways. But now seeing what you're confronting, and if you think about the timing, right, this was shortly after the inauguration of 45, right, of 45. Sorry, I'll wait till the. So shortly after the inauguration of 45, they said, seeing what you're going to be confronting, what you're going to be dealing with, we now see ourselves compelled to reciprocate the support. But what can we do? We don't have much. We can't send you livestock. We can't send you. Send you any money. But what we do have is coffee, and in essence, they tell a story there about how they went to all coffee producing families, and every family shared a kilo. Then they went to non-coffee producing families who gave 65 pesos, which for them is quite a bit. And they pulled together all this money, and with that money, they bought more coffee from coffee producing families. It amounted to about 3,000 kilos. They then took that, yeah, and all this free, right? They pulled this together as a way to support what they saw as struggles that were coming in the US amongst migrants, refugees, displaced communities. And once they had those 3,000 kilos, they took the coffee to another Zapatista family who happened to have a coffee roaster and a grinder, right? And shortly after they started toasting the coffee, the machine broke down. And once the machine broke down, one of the compas said, el capitalismo. And they share in the story, no, compa, this was not capitalismo. This was us. This was a failure on our part to do the proper maintenance to keep our networks, our sectors, our various different components that make us a community functioning and running. And in essence, it was a story about internal maintenance amongst our groups. So what they did then, and all this is a story in the communique, right? I said I was going to give the short version. I think I'm in mid-range now, but I'll try to bring it to a close soon. They next went to families that had livestock to get animal grease. They went to somebody who was a mechanic. They came back to the coffee lady. They fixed the machine. And in essence, this is a story about the coming together of the various different sectors that constitute our broader communities. And then in fixing the machine, they were finally able to toast it, the coffee, ended up being a little over 2,200 kilos. Some of that in particular went to some communities, very little, 150 or so in Catalonia, in Spain. But the bulk of that, 2,100 kilos, was destined for the US. Then came the next process, which was how do we get this coffee to the US? Many different groups that had historical ties to the Zapatistas went down there, met with them, and it was, others could probably speak to this a little bit better, but there was a realization that no one group alone had the means or capacity to get the coffee over here, right? And so it was also, in essence, a way of pushing us, giving us a little nudge, if you will, for those different groups who had for a long time done work with Zapatista solidarity work, more directly with Zapatista communities, to turn sideways and to look at each other, right? To no longer think solely in terms of our relationship of solidarity to the Zapatistas, but to think horizontally in terms of the various different adherentes to talk to each other, build with each other, and to build the basis, the networks, the capacity to be able to get the coffee across. Ultimately, some of the different orgs that had more resources were able to support getting the coffee to Tijuana. And then there in Tijuana, it fell upon some of us from San Diego, from the border, good or bad, however one may look at it, but having experience crossing borders, it fell upon us to get that coffee from Tijuana into San Diego, and we ended up doing it little by little, hormiga style, right, like ants. We were a collective that had no name. We actually acquired our name through the process. We were Hormigas Autónomas y Rebeldes, and we managed to get that coffee to San Diego, 2,100 kilos over the span of 2 months, 10 kilos, 20 kilos, 30 kilos at a time. And then once in San Diego, we managed to then put it together and separate, 1,000 for the West Coast and then 1,000 Chicago and all points east. But it was through the process of coming together to be able to get the coffee here and to cross it and to move it and to sell it that the network itself started. Now, back to the comunicado, and that last point I'll share is that in the comunicado, the Zapatistas say This coffee, again, is to support what's coming, for you all to figure out a way to organize yourselves. No strings attached. All we ask is that in sharing this coffee, in selling it as fundraisers for your orgs, in doing whatever you do for immigrant, displaced, indigenous, refugee communities, all we ask is that you tell the story of the coffee itself, because it's that story that, again, I'll return to the point of it being a lesson about the internal maintenance of ourselves as so-called leftist orgs, Zapatista-oriented orgs, that too often we fall into that being all about our org itself and not looking sideways to other orgs. And the very last point in the comunicado, they say, and if you asked us all how to describe what we're suggesting here, we have two words, and that's fuck Trump. So this became known as the fuck Trump coffee that we had distributed throughout the country in late 2017, early 2018. But in essence, that became the basis for what is now 5 years in, the continuation, ongoing building of this network. We've had different tours of the CNI concejales, but I think others will speak to that. But point is, this is a next step now in the current work of the network.
Hola a todos. My name is Imoat, so I come from unceded territory, Kumeyaay territory, San Diego, California. And I guess we're also here, we're all part of the editorial committee. There's probably 6 different committees within the network. But I guess the proposal of this journal came with a lot of, also a lot of background history regarding being able to archive and tell our own stories as grassroots organizations on the ground, instead of waiting for an academic to publish it. Now that we're against academics, there's academics within the network. But also, how do we share our own stories and archive our own history and our organizing? And also this distinction that the theory is not separated from our grassroots organizing. The grassroots organizers can also theorize, can also write and think. So I think this aspect of being able to write or to do this publication is to have this internal dialogue with different groups within the U.S. and be able to, and we did a call out that just came out last week. So we also invite all of you guys to share those stories because something that came, the first, I think the theme was, what is autonomy? And when we came to this dialogue within the network, it's like we don't have to come up with one particular defining term of autonomy for the entire network. So through our own internal dialogues, we realized we all have our different definitions of autonomy, and it's okay. Why do we need to put everything within a box and define it in one way? So this really gave us an insight, like, then let's hear each other, let's dialogue, and let's all share our own definitions of autonomy. So that's why you have one of the themes, how do we define autonomy within our own context, within our own geographies, and how do we share our own story of organizing, building our mutual aid, building co-ops, whatever that may be. So I think many of the groups they sympathize with Zapatismo, but something also that distincts this network is that we're not just here doing solidarity work with the Zapatistas. Not everybody has the privilege to fly to Chiapas or to be there. And the people that do fly, they too have a responsibility to report back about what happens there. So I think we wanted to create some form of venue or platform for those that had the privilege and opportunity to go to Chiapas, then write your report back. What is it that you learned? What did you bring back to your own communities? How are you sharing that story? So I think this is twofold. One is a responsibility that we have for those that have been down there to report back and to share that palabra. And second is to be able to reconnect with other groups that sympathize within Zapatista principles. They don't have to define themselves as Zapatistas, but they're using some of those principles within their organizing, and how do we share across these forms of cross-organizing and share our own stories, and also archive and be the ones telling the story, not have anybody outside or networks tell those story for us. So that was the understanding or proposal and why we presented this within the network. There's many projects that we work, so this is just one of many. But we're really excited that we started this conversation. We would definitely want to build and open those doors for many other groups that are organizing on the ground to also share and theorize together from the ground up. And I'll just leave it like that. Pass it on to Corbin.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you, Imad. So yeah, real quick, a little bit more about this first issue. The theme is autonomy from below and to the left in the U.S. And so there are a few articles or pieces related directly to that theme. And it ranges from a transcription of a speech by Ashanti Alston, who's a veteran of the Black Liberation Army, reflecting on his experiences in Chiapas and learning and reflecting on Zapatismo. Like Imad said, there's the collection of pieces around what autonomy means to you from different collectives and individuals within the network. There's a piece on abolition in Zapatismo, a short fiction piece that we'll be reading soon called Sunset Park 2040, and also a beautiful poem about the 7 principles of leading by obeying by a member of Sexta Grietas del Norte as well. And so, so yeah, and as Imad said, and you can look on our Instagram or website to see we have a call out for our future issues. We couldn't quite decide pick one, and so we're putting out a few and are looking for submissions, and then we'll see kind of see where that takes us as far as what the next issues will be, or the issue will be. And those themes that we wanted to focus on future themes include the theme of patriarchy, femicides, as well as women's struggles and feminism, food and land sovereignty is another one, and the storm is what the Zapatistas call it, or like the climate crisis and civilizational crisis. And so, check out our website, and you could submit. It's we'll give you the email at some point for submissions, but yeah.
And one thing I just want to reiterate, right? This first issue includes all pieces by folks that are currently members of Grietas, but we simply see ourselves as like initiators of this process to really encourage others, even whether you're part of the network or not, to really foment this conversation in the U.S. of what does Zapatismo, what does autonomy look like in our own context, and for us to start thinking again beyond just solidarity with people elsewhere, but bringing those struggles into our own trenches. So again, an open invitation for folks to contribute.
Yeah, and the email is journal@sextagrietasdelnorte.org. So I think we're going to close out with Kiki. Yeah.
So just to round this out, some folks are very curious about the production of the journal, and we maybe surprised ourselves, some of us, that we got it done, and because we got it done without any money. It was all volunteer. The only people that are paid are the printers. We don't own a printer, so we don't run one. We haven't taken one yet, so they're the ones that are getting paid, but everything in the journal is not copywritten. It's on their Creative Commons license, which allows folks to take whatever you want, remix it, and just put it out there with the condition that you don't commercialize it, and that you also allow others to remix what you remixed. And so then that creates that Creative Commons, yeah? And so then everything here, all of the writings, all of the art is in that spirit, and it's something that's a little bit difficult sometimes to find among the left. Like a lot of the time we're used to needing to be paid, which makes a lot of sense because we're all forced to have money in order to live under empire, under capitalism. And so a big part of the work that we do is recognizing that dependency and then trying to create an independence from that model where money has to be what articulates between you and me, and you and the world, and me and the world, right? And so it's something that is able to be produced at this moment in the context that we're in, where we have to use money, where we have to have an income stream of some kind. So many of us have like a regular job that has nothing to do with anything that we do in various degrees. Some of it, yes, a lot of it, no. And then the other work that we do is the work of building autonomy, and that is without an expectation that it's going to be funded. And it allows us to maintain our autonomy because, as we know, with the nonprofit industrial complex, a lot of the time we lose the vision and become so dependent on external funders, and then have to shape our ways of being and our politics and our proposals into what they want to see. And so it's something that we're very careful about. It's something that the Zapatistas model all of the time. And so this is the production of the journal. Again, we have the call out for contributions, and one of the agreements, if you want to contribute, is that you agree to license it under this Creative Commons license. And if you're an artist, we love you, especially a lot of the time, you know, artists make a living off of it, and it's like this very strange place where working for free. A lot of the time there's a lot of exploitation, like, oh, you'll get exposure, and with writers too. Writers and artists a lot of time don't get paid. We're not paying anybody, just letting you know. I hope that's okay. That's the part of the political work. There's working for money and then working for autonomy, and those are very separate things. And at this moment, we're straddling them both until we can create that other world where many worlds fit in that autonomous fashion in a stronger way. It's something that we're building little by little. We know that it's going to take a lot of time, but with that commitment, even going slow, I mean, the journal itself took quite a while to, I think it was a year, right, since we had the proposal from NYC for it, and then it's come out. We had never done anything like this before, very much in the spirit of asking questions as we walk and being very forgiving to ourselves and to each other with a lot of compassion, because sometimes things don't work out, and we just keep learning more and more and more each time. I think I'll leave it there unless there are, are we doing Q&A at the end or at the end? Yeah, so if you have any questions about it or any comments, we'd love to hear from you at the end. Hopefully you'll stick around, and if you don't want to do it in a public forum, please reach out to, or just find one of us, and we'd be happy to chat with you.
I'm just gonna quick shout out that Kiki did the illustrations for this first issue, and they are incredible, and so we invite other artists that are interested in contributing their art, but like shout out to Kiki for the amazing work she did.
Shout out to the writers too. That content's pretty incredible. The art is, it just so happened, we wanted to design a black and white journal to make it affordable, and I just happened to know how the type of artwork that I do is charcoal. And then it turned out that we were able to find a more affordable solution for color. So we have a color option and a black and white option. We're all sold out of the color. We have a few black and whites at the table, and we're hoping to get more printed very soon. But if you don't get one today, please check out our website, sextagrietaasdelnorte.org, to see when new ones are coming back in stock, hopefully in 2 weeks.
So thank you. So we're gonna jump into some readings. And so we're gonna start with a piece that was distributed to all y'all. It should be on your chairs. It's called Sunset Park 2040. So I'm gonna invite Ciel. Unfortunately, not all of the authors were able to make it tonight. But shout out to Jess and Michelle for also their contributions to this. So this piece was originally, it was written by all members of, or participants in kind of an experiment that popped off shortly before the pandemic, and called the Sunset Park Popular Assembly, where, following reflections on some of the community organizing happening in the neighborhood, a lot of people who were involved in the fight against Industry City, kind of like thinking about lessons from that and the necessity for like social infrastructure that's durable, that lasts and is a through line through struggles. We're looking at different models of community assemblies and other ways of organizing. And you know, one of the inspirations and things we referenced were the Zapatistas and the 7 principles. Shortly after our first meeting, which included folks calling in from Chile and Puerto Rico, talking about their experiences with popular assemblies, and we had this whole plan of like this slow, intentional process. The pandemic hit, which created the necessity for people to organize and respond. And so we kind of adapted what we were thinking about to a online kind of format, which had, you know, all the limitations we know about. But it was a space that kind of incubated some dope projects that are still going on. And yeah, one of the things that we were invited to do was to contribute to an exhibit by a dope artist from Sunset Park, Betty Yu, who invited us to contribute to a radical housing manifesto, which was part of a Imagining De-Gentrified Futures exhibit. And so instead of like writing an essay or we were like, why don't we like write some fiction imagining what that world, that de-gentrified future already looks like. And so it was a new experience for, I think, a lot of us, but it was really a lot of fun. And so this is the piece that we published for that. And then so we had it republished for this journal. And so yeah, it's split into 3 parts. It's like 3 vignettes of like different people of different ages and their kind of their day in the liberated Sunset Park. And so I'm gonna start and then pass it to Ciel. And then, but Ciel, you wanna introduce yourself first?
I just wanted to quickly introduce myself. My name is Ciel. I'm really grateful to be invited into this space. My family is from the Dominican Republic. I was born in Brooklyn, but it was really beautiful to be able to reflect on my family's history and use that as the basis for imagining the future. And so the character that I created for this piece, her name is Esperanza, and I based her off of my grandmother and also one of my neighbors in my building. And so yeah, I just wanted to acknowledge that because I think our elders it's impossible to imagine the future without our elders. And I'm really grateful to have the background that I do and to be learning more about my culture and my identity as a Taino person, and being constantly reminded that there's no future without the knowledge that we inherit from our elders.
So, thank you. So, yeah. So, Sunset Park 2040. It's been 15 years since the uprising. Members of the Sunset Park Popular Assembly reflect on daily life in a liberated East Lenapehoking and how they each contribute to their community. San, age 20. My day began early, harvesting pumpkins in the milpa that surrounds Sunset Park. In between poking around the prickly leaves and vines for ripe pumpkins, I'd watch my neighbors go about their morning routines. I spotted my compa Valerie from the youth council passing by on 5th Avenue and waved. Buenos dias, San, she called from the street. See you tonight. Working at the milpa can be hard work, but I enjoy this rotation of my urban agroecology apprenticeship more than the oyster and seaweed cooperative at Jamel Floyd Park. I'll take scratchy vines over the freezing water any day. Most of what's produced by the farm cooperatives get distributed to local schools, and it feels good knowing that my work contributes to my community's health and autonomy. At the Milpa, I work with Auntie Joanne, who can be found with her famous homemade cookies and cosmetics at the Thursday night market, and Don Rigoberto, who's never caught without his signature embroidered vest, from the Sindicato de Campesinas Urbanes. They can talk a lot, but they also are great listeners and so kind. They always make sure to feed me after a morning of hard work. Today, Don Rigo brought tamales made from our own corn, and Auntie Jo brought scallion pancakes. We sat in the orchard for lunch after the harvest. Auntie Jo and Don Rigo talked about how it was before the popular assemblies instituted land reform. how our Mother Earth and homes were called property and real estate, how landlords bought and sold them for profit, forcing the dispossessed and racialized peoples to rent tiny crumbling apartments or live in the streets, public parks, and subways, of how the mal gobierno and the political parties ruled from above, serving the interests of landlords and bosses, while they manipulated our people with false promises and fear. Everything we could see, from the milpa to my apartment building to the salt marshes of Mannahatta in the distance, had been collectivized and redistributed according to social and ecological need following the uprising. The original stewards of the territory, the Lenape, had rematriated back to their homeland after the fall of the colonial government, and now all decisions over land use here in East Lenapehoking are made with their consultation and consent. From where we sat, I could see the memorial to those martyred by the Mal Gobierno's police, migra, and military in the northeast corner of the park. I stared at it as Auntie Jo shared that there were times when she almost lost hope, when fascism seemed inevitable. A truck with a loudspeaker went up 44th Street, reminding us that our neighborhood assembly was this evening. I listened as I ate, feeling humbled and grateful to those who sacrificed to free the earth and her people, allowing us, as Don Rigo says, to finally be human beings again.
Jay, age 43. Hiba, Sophia, and Celeste all stay home from school today. Everyone's exhausted from the fun last night, so we decided to sleep in. Hiba's aunt and cousin, Amti Soad and Basma, are going back to Morocco on Saturday, and Frankie just got back from San Francisco de Macorís, so we celebrated with food and karaoke in Sunset Park. Hiba spent a lot of time learning to cook with her aunt this past month, so she made couscous for everyone. It was delicious, especially with all the vegetables from the milpa. Frankie had everyone rolling on the ground laughing with her throwback Disney covers. Sophia, of course, was so happy to see her again. Her connection with Frankie is special. Frankie and I were the first ones up this morning, so the two of us walked over to see our friends on 54th Street. Sean and some of the Theos from the block made a huge batch of his famous chicken and waffles, so we picked up enough for all of us. Frances gave us some maple syrup that she tapped in the Bronx, and I had a bottle of hot sauce stuffed from my visit to my sister, the perfect touches for the meal. Over breakfast, the kids asked us to tell them stories about when we were children. It's always fascinating to see their reactions. Even though it hasn't been that long, their world is so different. Today, I told them about the time I got my hair cut short for the first time. I loved how my new haircut looked on me, but when I went to school, the kids all laughed at me. One of the teachers even scolded me when I went to the bathroom, telling me, "This is the girls' restroom." I tried to explain how stressful it was, but Sophia and Celeste just giggled. They thought it was so silly that my short hair was such a big deal. Amti Suad chimed in, "You think that's strange? 15 years ago, we couldn't even come here without permission from the government. We tried for years and years, but they just wouldn't give us that damn piece of paper. They rarely gave them to people like us." The kids twisted their faces, perplexed. They've heard about borders and visas and citizenship before, since many of our friends, family, and neighbors have stories. Stories about living in the shadows, stories about being separated from loved ones by invisible lines in the sand, stories about crossing those lines, only to suffer exploitation and oppression on the other side, and stories of being placed inside dark, cold cells. But they still don't totally understand. I don't think I would either. People have freedom to move around now, and no longer have to fear being thrown into a cold, dark cell by the government. The kids finished breakfast and got ready to meet their friends at Jamel Floyd Park, close to the site where the infamous MDC prison once stood. Sometimes I feel jealous of them, jealous that they never had to go up against the big land developers who wanted to force us all out of our neighborhood, or that they'll never have to worry about their loved ones being locked behind those drab walls at MDC. But I'm also grateful for how we've been able to transform Sunset Park since the uprising, and I'm excited to see what we can continue to make of this world together. And I can't lie, I do love seeing the elders' faces every time Celeste confuses the word landlord for wizard. Esperanza, age 84. My morning cafecito tastes better by the window. My neighbors wave to me as they trickle down our block on their way to work at the waterfront. Salim, Crystal, Jinwei, Xiomara, AJ, a knock at the door. I finish the last sip of my coffee and grab my cane to answer. Alzao, Senora Esperanza. Jenny greets me with a big smile. I picked an eggplant for you, along with some more pigeon pea pods ready for shelling. I'm running late for my apprenticeship at the bike shop, so I'll catch you at our meeting later. She takes off before I can thank her. For the last few years, Jenny has tended my plot on our building's shared rooftop conuco. It's my piece of the Taino nation here in Lenape, Hoking. I miss the thick, humid air of the greenhouse, but I can't make the climb up to the roof anymore. Here on the ground, I still have our native plant garden, the blooming tree my mother left me, and the community that grows in its shade. I lean out the window and ask one of the neighborhood children running up the hill to PS 94 to stop and pass me a fistful of bee balm from the garden. Unmarried and without children, I never imagined I'd have anyone to leave anything to. When the pandemic struck, I was at risk and alone. Soon, young folks from the Popular Assembly noticed my solitude and began to bring me groceries, and sometimes, from a safe distance, they'd linger to learn more about me. They resurfaced memories of my childhood in the mountains of Quisqueya, where all we had was each other, the river, and God. It was humble, but we had dignity. I stir my pot of sancocho and watch the steam rise to fill the room with the smell of my island. In the years leading to the uprising, those young people reminded me our city was made of islas too, and that we lived on earth and among rivers that could still sustain us and teach us and heal us if only we cared for the land in return. They reminded me we still had each other and that we needed each other. They said they needed even me. I'd been alone for so long I had forgotten what that felt like. How could I have known my stories would be fuel for a revolution? How could my mother have known my name, Esperanza, would be prophetic? Now I serve with the Elders' Council of the Popular Assembly, guided by Lenape elders to revive and preserve the knowledge that took generations to accumulate. This month, we on the Safety Committee prepared a discussion series on peacemaking and restorative justice practices in other communities in order to continue developing our own practices in Sunset Park. Tonight, we'll study the Mamas of Rojava, a group of women elders in liberated Syria who have kept their community safe by serving as mediators between the families they already know and love. As the late afternoon sun begins to tinge everything gold, Jenny, AJ, Xiomara, Jinwei, Crystal, and Salim drag themselves back up the steep hill of our block and plop down heavily in our garden like overripe fruit. I carefully bring a tall pitcher of iced bee balm tea to the windowsill and sweeten it with honey from the Milpas apiary. I give them time to fill their bottles with the pale pink drink and rest in the breeze under my mother's tree before we begin our meeting. I pour myself a glass last. Everything tastes better by the window.
Oh, thank you. Sweet. So yeah, we'll have questions at the end if anybody wants to talk about it, any of these pieces. But next we have the Askeltan report back with Kiki and Daisy.
Yeah, it's fine. Thank you.
start talking about it if you'd like.
Thank you, everyone. We're very honored to be in New York, to have had our compas from New York, from Sunset Park, who contributed a piece, read that in their geography. Well, ish, you know, we don't want to homogenize New York. We also are very honored to have our compañera Daisy, who has been a member of Grietas for many years and is a medic, and did a lot of work, not just help, did a lot of work to organize and help build an autonomous clinic in a native community in Jalisco, Mexico, which is Daisy's ancestral geographies, and created an enormous health brigade of midwives, other Cuban-trained doctors like Daisy, and other kinds of healers, and many of us who went, well, from Grietas, we wrote a report back. So there's a report back on that in this issue. And so what we'll do is we will have Daisy and Igor, who are part of that brigade, have a conversation about it, and then we'll do a very brief reading. Does that sound good? Wonderful. Adelante.
Gracias, compañera. Y gracias, compañero Igor, because we just kind of put you on the spot. Sí, so la comunidad de Esqueltán, San Lorenzo de Esqueltán in Jalisco is an indigenous Tepehuano and Wirarica community in Jalisco that is quite an example because it's explicitly applying the siete principios, the 7 principles of the ECLN. It's part of the Indigenous Peoples Congress at CNE. And through that and through its collective organization, over the years, they've been able to recuperate more than about 40,000 hectares of land. And we're still going, right? And so something that I've learned, or I think something that comes up in New York City a lot is that there's a lot of attraction to the aesthetic of the ECLN or the poetics, or that sometimes folks read the communiques of the CNI and the ECLN, La Palabra, which is truly like what the ECLN gives us, right? They're our teachers through their palabra. They're the example through their autonomy, and so are also the pueblos that make up the CNI that are doing this in various parts of Mexico, and I think this is often overlooked or not known, and Esqueltán is an example of this. And I always tell folks, you know, it's not just a metaphor, it's something that a compa once told me is like, los pueblos hablamos otro idioma porque escuchamos la madre tierra, porque somos personas de fe, una fe milenaria, una fe fuerte, ancestral. And when we think about what does it mean to decolonize politics and organizing, it's inevitable to not make a connection between spirituality and what comes from ceremony in Esqueltán, what comes from el fuego, el maracame, San Lorenzo, los santos, la comunidad. Not only fighting in collective, healing in collective, praying in collective, listening to the ancestors in collective. So for me to go back to my ancestral land and very clearly understand why my whole life led up to a moment of why I had to walk this path and get the training that I have to arrive at the moment in which the community, through talking to the ancestors and through an asamblea, a general assembly, organizing, right, collectively decide that in order for the autonomy to grow, we need to have an autonomous clinic. And in that, there's a spiritual cargos and responsibilities that you have to take on. And so I did, and I didn't know that I did this when I had brain cancer and a brain tumor, which I just got removed, right? But the ancestors illuminated this path. About a year later, only a year later, despite the pandemic, we built this brigade. We raised about $20,000 in about 2 months. The clinic is built con las manos y los corazones de la comunidad. La clínica está enfrente de la clínica del gobierno, in front of the bad government, which is empty, está vacía, nunca hay servicio, there's never service. Our clinic, which is called Vida y Esperanza, Life and Hope, this is what the community called it. And it was also decided after ceremony, after consulting with the ancestors y los dioses, right? Y Dios, eso es lo que se decidió, Vida y Esperanza, is now fully equipped. We're gonna extend another part of the clinic where we're gonna just focus on natural medicine, but tenemos medicina de bata blanca, which is a bit more Western, and we have fully stocked pharmacy. And we start to inject autonomy, but also the community, surrounding community becomes more politicized and interested in la lucha because they came to get free services, they came to escuchar la palabra, to understand the struggle, because there's so much defamation against the community, right, for rising up against not just the government, but the cartels that are working with the government that surround the area. So despite all of this, there's still an autonomous community. They still managed to build this clinic. We still realize our brigade, and we still have a lot more. Falta lo que falta to do. I hope that if you have the ability to someday travel, or if you're interested in being part of our brigade, like we said, as long as you have manos y corazón, you are welcomed. We talk about decolonizing health. Right now, for my postdoc in the US, I'm trying to experiment applying an indigenous framework using those siete principios, the ECLN, to decolonize the current public health model in the US. And it really is, it's not impossible, I think people still don't, to understand autonomy you really have to understand what it means to dream in collective. And the title of this article and what we have in front of the clinic that the children wrote is Kepetihenu. So in Wirarica, good morning is usually Keaku, Kepetihenu, which means what did you dream of? So dreams are very important. And this is part of like the indigenous cosmovisión, right? Los sueños. So what happens then when you start to dream in collective and move in collective and then apply these 7 principles, right? It takes time, but we also have to explore what does it mean to decolonize time? Who imposes time? Assemblies in the communities, even with the compas, could take days and you still don't come up with an acuerdo, and that's okay. You continue caminar preguntando, right? Until you find consensus. And I think that in New York, I have unfortunately seen a lot of division, a lot of ego or individualism, but it's okay. It's not to judge. It's just we need to really start, I think, considering to be real with ourselves on whether or not we're applying and actually putting these principles into practice. Be patient and meet people where they're at as well, right? And the compas and the communities teach us this. It's always lento pero avanzando, right? And it's not about us. It's about the future, right? It's about the collective dream. And this journal is another sueño colectivo, no? It's coming true for Grietas. So I didn't really prepare anything in particular, so I'm gonna give space for Kiki to share, and compa Igor, who is from Mexico, now lives in New York, but his amazing mother is a midwife who's worked directly with the Zapatista women and who shared so many lessons with the women of Azqueltan. I also have to say that through the building of the clinic and having the midwives who are so important, my abuela, Isidra, was a healer, sanadora, my mom era una enfermera, and so, all of this, and Marichi told me this, like, it's la lucha por la vida y en la tierra is very much connected to healing. And in a lot of the CNI communities, either the midwives or the concejales are also like the doctors of the community, and they're also like, involved in la lucha por la tierra. It's interconnected and it goes hand in hand. And as I always say, when we heal, she heals, Mother Earth heals, and when she heals, it's a reciprocal thing, right? And process, and our ancestors are absolutely with us, and they've obviously gave me the strength to get through making the dream of the clinic with the community come true. And I just wanted to remind everyone that it's extremely important to just listen to her, listen to Mother Earth. Even in New York, I know it's difficult to make that connection, but to just listen to the birds and acknowledge the, not the land, its history, the trees, Tayao Tao, which is the sun, and Wirarika. And, and learning to dream in collective and having faith in that will always build and not destroy. And I think that the compas, this is what we've seen as a medic or as a public health professional in the midst of the pandemic. We saw what capitalism does when something like this happens, and we saw how resilient they were, how they were able to protect themselves and continue to grow their caracoles, their communities during the pandemic, right? In our community, or at least in Askeltan, we did the same. What the bad government didn't do, the community did. And so I hope that as we move forward in the US, we can stop just saying, decolonize health, but actually consider indigenous frameworks, Black liberation frameworks, and how the ancestors did it, right? How we are still here because of that wisdom and and that knowledge. And so I really thank the folks that are here that joined us in the brigade, and I hope someday you can visit Askeltan or ceremony, or even when you go home tonight. Part of our homework with the Maracame, because he was part of the process of the brigade, was he would give us like little homeworks and things to bring to ceremony, and we all had to have our little white candle. And then once we got there, it all made sense, right? And so, I encourage you to connect with Las Cuatro Direcciones, acknowledge with la naturaleza, whether it's just the fire or the sun. She's there, she's with us. I know it's really hard in the city, and it's easy to sometimes get lost, but our soul really needs it, and it's the medicine we need. So, thank you, compa.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, I participate a little bit with Compa Daisy in this project that was, for in a personal way, it's a lot about borders, no? Because, we have this, like, no human is illegal, no? And I came here, like, to work, like, legally, but all my people I have met from our country, they work in stores or delivery, no? So all the stories they are telling, how they crossed the borders, how was all this, it's like something like this, very charged, no? After is like the first generation of some people that arrived, we talk with them, and there is this missing of like identity, no? And it's very powerful, because I think like everybody, like when we are, well, there is something that they say, like when you are pushed to the freedom or something, you are missing this identity, and this everything that has been happening about this project, like with ACLN and all this, is bringing to all these people, is bringing the identity that is very strong, no? Like when you met first generation, second generation are born here, and they are like, oh, I saw that ECLN are doing this, and I see that Sexta del Norte are doing this. They feel this identity, and this is very powerful, no? The second, sure. Yeah, and then it's like about, in particular, the project was very magical, no? Like my mom is a midwife. She was when Mexico. There was a time like, well, still having problems of health, but there was a time like was very traditional, the health, and some were to very far away communities were bringing like new projects of health. She was in an indigenous community. She was helping a lot of people to get born. She was, that was like 40, 50 years ago. So after she came with us, she was sharing with the community. There was a connection. Was a circle of women, and everybody was just talking about like, oh, how many kids you have had, and most of, some of them were like, I have had like 3 children, and they were, I got it alone, no, by myself. But then I have 2 that were more complicated, and then they bring me to like a hospital that was far away, no? But everyone was sharing. That was very powerful, no? Like to feel that, yeah. But then just like the ceremony, for example, that Daisy talked also was so magical, no? Like the Maracame was there, was praying, and then everyone was like this connection was very powerful. And again, just this connection, for me, this project that was at Quezon is like a little bit connected with Grietas, is between the north and the south. There is not borders, no? Like the connection between this was very powerful, no? Like as Daisy said, like can be support people that is working here, that is sending resources there, or the identity that is coming, no? There is two stories. One was from the Maracame, that he said like, we have lost the way we dance, no? So they didn't remember that, but
Recuperating the ancestral danzas is one of the priorities right now that came. So we are thinking of doing a danza festival next, probably. But like a festival of resistance of all indigenous danza. The compa shared a little bit, but how important the danzas, because each danza is a prayer of flor, and that it's vital for us to make sure that the youth and the younger generations don't forget those danzas.
yeah.
Y la defensa por la cultura was talked about a lot, and defense of preserving culture and protecting Mother Earth is something that was shared a lot during ceremony. I don't know if Kiki wants to add about the ceremony. But.
Just one more word. No? Yeah, sure. And then the other story was one people that was from the CNA that they came and they say like, well, in my community we forgot our native language, and someone that came to the U.S. came back to the community and told the native language that they had forgotten. No? So this connection between North and South and breaking borders, I think, yeah, thank you so much for inviting
I think for
me.
Askeltan, another magical thing is that the only one anthropologist that was in Askeltan who documented a book of Tepehuano prayers was a doctor who was also an anthropologist who only speaks English. So the translations are in English through Tepehuano, but they never got translated to Spanish. And right now, part of the struggle is strong because the Tepehuanos and the Wiraricas, who had not done ceremony since like the time of since before the colonization, there's been a lot of division and racism, but now they do ceremony together. The Tepehuanos now want to speak their native language in the way that the Huiras do. And I was able to find this book, but it's in English, right? So now a lot of us who speak English, who maybe are Chicanx or whatever, we're helping translate it into Spanish for the compa so that they can start to use the book of prayer and recover Tepehuano language. So yeah, that's an interesting point of how all of that is. But the ancestors do leave all these treasures behind. It's just that I think the more we connect with spirit, the easier it becomes for us to find it and recuperate and recover it and reclaim it.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Igor. Thank you, Daisy. So you've been hearing CNI. Maybe you've caught on to that. That's the National Indigenous Congress. And the journal's title is Grietas, which means cracks, which is, all of our small resistances just keep pounding on that structure, that wall, make some cracks, and don't stop because the cracks will heal. The subtitle, the other part of the journal's name is A Journal of Zapatista Thought and Horizons, and a really important Zapatista Thought and Horizon is a National Indigenous Congress, which is after the Zapatista uprising in 1994, the Zapatistas, long story, beautiful, incredible strategic minds that they are, were able to hack the dialogues with the government and force the government to invite all indigenous peoples of Mexico into the dialogues with the government. And it allowed the Zapatistas, who are indigenous peoples in Chiapas, to encounter. And it allowed all of these groups to meet, all these peoples to meet and share stories. And like how Daisy was saying, lots of divisions from so much trauma in the past 500 years allowed the sharing to take place. So this journal is not just a Zapatista journal, it's also very much influenced by the work of the CNI, which the Zapatistas are a part of. It's a large network space of encounter to share about struggle, and then recognizing, hey, your struggle sounds a lot like mine, and then organizing in that way. And this community in Askeltan is part of the CNI. And so in the journal, we try to share more about the CNI because not a lot of folks know about it. And so it's such a treat to be able to have the report back about the health brigade in Askeltan, because you get to get a glimpse, catch a glimpse of the work of the CNI and how incredibly important it is. And so with that, I would love to just read a small excerpt for you. That's okay. And there's so many excerpts. Daisy tasked me with finding one, and I couldn't figure out which one. But I think that the one on ceremony for those of us who came from in the brigade came to Askeltan. Many Grietas members are already very much in an indigenous world, and it includes ceremony, and others are not. And a lot of the left does not really talk that much about spirituality. A lot of the time we think of it as the same thing as religion, this doctrinal, you better do this, this, and that. Or spirituality, very much different from that. Spirituality being like the ways that we understand ourselves in the world, in the universe, the entire metaphysics of time and space and the meaning of life and why are we here. And so while we went to Askeltan to help construct this autonomous clinic for healing in Askeltan, the community there was so generous and allowed us space in their ceremonial healing. And so many of us realized, wow, it's undescribable. It's something that needs to be felt. Maybe you felt a little bit of it in the opening ceremony today. With the compas, it was a whole, it was a peyote ceremony. They call it rosita, and it was a night over the entire night with a fire, and you could read more about it in the report back. And I just want to read about those of us who collectively wrote the report back on the section of ceremony and spirituality. Just want to read 2 paragraphs so you can kind of get a sense. In ceremony, the community offers gratitude and sustenance to nature, deities, who then in turn send back energy and strength and offer guidance to the community. We were invited to participate in traditional ceremonies where offerings are made to Mother Earth and energy and guidance is transmitted from the ancestors. Mario, a Wirarica trained in spiritual practices, who was also elected as an authority, personally approached many of us, encouraging us to participate in the ceremonies and explaining how we could do so. He wanted us to learn about how to offer gratitude and sustenance to Mother Earth in order to receive her energy and strength. He said, Mother Earth is hungry and thirsty, just like we are. So we can all begin to live like this, to make offerings, to give to her, because the earth gives to us what we need, and Mother Earth needs us to give to her too. He wanted us to participate in the practices that indigenous traditions offer, because making offerings to Mother Earth means giving her energy so that the same energy can strengthen humans. As indigenous, if we don't do this, the struggle is worthwhile, but proceeds very slowly. But when we walk with nature, we get much more strength. It gives us knowledge that we human beings cannot imagine on our own. At the invitation of our hosts, we joined the community in a collective hike up to a sacred mountain site, Cerro de Colotlan. Gracias, compa. Where we held candles as the Tepehuano dancers, dressed in their traditional garments, reenacted their ancient stories. Later that evening, we moved to the town square and gathered around a roaring fire where the Wiraricas performed their dances. We were invited to share a drink of rosita, this is the peyote, prepared with great love and care by our hosts. As we sat together by the fire until dawn, everyone was invited to share their thoughts. Some people spoke of their suffering from the violence of their adversaries. Others spoke of the joy they felt at this gathering. Brigade members shared their awe and appreciation of our new brothers and sisters in the Askeltan community. Many shared intimate feelings. We listened to the words of the Maracame, the shaman, who counseled on practices of grieving and healing. As we gazed into the ceremonial fire, we felt it enter our bodies, creating an emotional and spiritual warmth that opened our hearts and bonded us to this project that, from that moment, expanded beyond the community of Askeltan and into each one of our own geographies. Thank you. Thank you, compas. We're going to move on to our final bit of reading, it's really going to be conversation, and then we can move on to our collective conversation. Does that sound good? Great. Thank you. Thank you, Daisy and Igor. We can give it up for Daisy one more time. She just got out of brain surgery, and she made it. Great. So something else in the journal, oops, sorry. Something else in the journal, well, two things else in the journal are report backs, writings about something the Zapatistas and the CNI did this past summer that surprised a lot of us following them over these last decades, and that is that they left Mexico for the first time to go travel around the world. They had a communique come out last year, October of 2020, like, hi, pandemic, that's what they were going to do. And we're like, wow. And the reason for it, well, many reasons, but to try to listen to what struggles are doing in other corners of the world. And they said that they were going to travel the 5 continents, and they chose Europe as a first one, which surprised a lot of us, especially those of us with histories of anti-colonial struggle, because when we think of Europe, a lot of the time we think of Europe as a homogeneous space. And the gift that the Zapatistas gave many of us is that recognition that, there's a lot of struggle, and there's always been a lot of struggle within Europe. There's a Europe from below. There's another Europe. And the compas have known this for quite a while because many of these European compas in struggle visit them. So now it was time for the Zapatistas and the CNI to visit these European compas. So several of us were very blessed to be able to go at that specific moment and witness. And one of the things that they did, that the Zapatistas did, was make it so that on the 500-year anniversary of Hernan Cortez's taking of Tenochtitlan on August 13th, 1521, right? So 2021, August 13th, they decided to march on Madrid in Columbus Plaza. And so something that, so we have a really beautiful report back by some compas.
Well, I'm seeing that the image behind us is they traveled by boat.
Yeah.
Specifically, and said, we're going to invade Madrid. But unlike what the colonizers came and did here, we're not going there to impose anything. We're going there to listen. We're going there to meet the Europe from below, because in many ways we recognize that there's also struggle there, that I would put it, if we think solely in terms of indigenous here, colonizers or white over there, then we've already accepted one of the founding mythologies of colonization, and that is that Europe is white, that Europe is homogeneous, right? That, in particular, Spain, as having what is the geography that is now Spain, having for over 700 years been under Islamic rule, right? So even Spain itself has never been white, right? So I share that because I'm a professor of Chicano studies, and oftentimes when I run some seminars in Spain called Decolonizing Knowledge and Power, and I always get the question, what do you mean decolonizing Spain? F that, we got to do that shit over here. But I think what the Zapatistas showed us, and many of us have been saying, is that no, that Europe also has to decolonize itself, meaning recognize its own fictions, recognize its own struggles on the ground. And I apologize I interrupted, but I saw the picture, and I'm seeing another one I wanted to touch on, but I'll go back to Kiki.
This is a map of where the Grietas are. I don't know if you can, it's Turtle Island, yeah? And it was really nice putting up stars there because we realized, wow, we're growing a flank on the right shoulder of this turtle, and it's here, actually, there's so much to talk about. We don't have, sadly, as much time, but through the journal, we can have these conversations. Something I wanted to point out were these two pieces. So one of them is the US from below and to the left encounters tierra insumisa, fragments, dreams, and notes. Tierra insumisa is what the Zapatistas renamed that land, that geography. Slumil Kashemkok in Celtal, I believe, one of the native languages of the Zapatista communities. And it means rebellious lands, or lands that have not submitted yet, have not yet submitted, yeah, that's how we translate, yeah? And so here we have a lot of the Cristian, Vasquez, Maritza, Jeronimo, Gustavo Garcia, and Natalia Toscano, who I was very lucky to accompany. And they share here a lot of these thoughts and feelings, kind of like in contradiction, because all five of us never, ever wanted to go to Spain, never thought we'd even, much less Madrid, and then we find ourselves here and we're seeing a different Spain, a different Madrid, but it's because the Zapatistas made the call, and so then they came out into be seen, into the light, and so we were able to encounter each other. And so these are fragments, dreams, and notes. And then the other piece that talks about the broader trip, if you're interested, it's fascinating. The Journey for Life of the EZLN and CNI by Rosa Maria Barajas and Enrique Dávalos, who are from the Raíces Sin Fronteras collective. And here they document, and both of these pieces have these beautiful photographs that serve archival purposes in addition to sharing. And here you can read the story of everything that they had to go through to even make this happen. And something that I wanted to chat with Roberto about is because Roberto has been telling us for a long time, as part of the school, about this other Spain especially. And he didn't get to go with us this summer, even though he gets to go every summer. In the summer, the Zapatistas and the CNI go. He wasn't able to make it. But so many of his teachings we carried with us. And one thing that, he was on my mind a lot. I had the opportunity to visit Granada, which was the last stronghold of the African Muslims, the Moors, before Europe becomes modern Europe that we know, or Spain becomes the modern Spain that we know, which is an ethnically cleansed land. The reason why I went is I'm writing a book on Palestine, putting the Palestinian liberation movement in conversation with the last 500 years of anti-colonial resistance, rather than just beginning it at the 19th century. Like most of the time we're taught about Palestine, that the problem is when Jews from Europe come to Palestine and colonize, which makes us think that this is the problem between Jews and Palestinians or Jews and Arabs, where my argument, it's the problem of the world itself. And so what is this world that we're talking about? The modern world of 1492. 1492, we know 1492 of October 12, 1492. Compa here has been insisting to many of us, there's also another 1492 that goes in conjunction with this, and that is January 2nd, 1492, which was the fall of Granada. When Europe begins to understand itself as modern Europe, in that it's imposing one world on that territory, kicking out Muslims, forcing Jews to convert or flee, and if they don't convert or flee, then they're executed, threat of execution. And so I went to Granada with Roberto on my mind a lot because I accidentally stumbled, I don't know what made me stumble into it, but the Museum of the Inquisition's torture methods. And there we see, it was very clear to me that the kinds of torture, like the book burning, in addition to things like book burning of the Maya books, for example, had already happened to people living in Europe before it happened to us. The Black radical tradition has been telling us slavery existed between Europeans before they enslaved the rest of us. And so then there's something there that we've been missing about, in a way, accepting these divisions of Europe and non-Europe that are colonial, right? Where Europeans are superior and non-Europeans are rendered inferior under the framework of colonialism. And so I wanted to give you space, Roberto, because you didn't get to join us, but there's so much on our minds, so much in these pieces, especially the Madrid compas and all who went. And we were just remarking on how it was kind of like, at least for me, it was kind of like a short circuit, which was a really great short circuit in my brain. I got challenged. And it opened up more beautiful ways for me to understand our struggle, my struggle, and Palestine. Because I also found out while I was there in Granada, I started to read up about the fall of Granada, and Christopher Columbus was there, waiting in the wings for Granada to fall, because he knew that once Granada fell, then Queen Isabella would have his attention for his proposal to travel west to get to the east. And I dug in deeper, and it turned out his impulse for that, his motivation for that, we often hear is because he wanted money and riches. He was similarly a fundamentalist Catholic trying to impose the one world on the rest of the world, and thought that, and this is in his journals and his diaries, after Granada, Jerusalem next. Goes west, massive speed bump, we might call it, this entire continent, right? So then Palestine becomes colonized, not right then, but a couple hundred years later, after they've refined some techniques of colonization already on themselves, then on us, and then on Palestine, and the story goes on. So, compa, I wanted to give you some time.
Yeah, so I'll just be brief so that we could get more to conversation, but just a couple points here, kind of off of what Kiki's been sharing. In essence, Columbus had already previously asked the Queen for permission to sail west, but the Queen told them, hold up until we deal with Granada. Once Granada falls, then you get green light to go. But the important part being also that the metaphysical goal, if you will, of the retaking of Jerusalem was already on the mind of Columbus. So in many ways, we could say 1492 also constitutes the beginning of the Nakba, right? That it's already part and parcel. And understood in this way becomes important then to think that even though we live in a supposed modern world, I prefer saying modern colonial world that is secular, at its heart is still inherently, I would argue, Christian-centric. And we lose sight of that because what that moment means, and this is why in the center of Granada you have a statue of Isabella with Columbus on his knees asking her permission. But what that moment means is that what happens through the West west coast of Africa in terms of the kidnapping, enslaving, and transporting of peoples, eventually the arrival into the Americas. The way I see it is more the opening of two fronts in the same war that was already underway, which was the war between Christendom and Islam. And so Africa and the Americas are two fronts in that same war and not otherwise. And I say that because understood in this way, it becomes easier then to understand that the struggle against anti-Black racism, the struggle against Islamophobia, the struggle against Indianism, and even for that matter, the struggle against anti-Semitism is part and parcel of the same struggle, right? They're not separate struggles in different historical moments that we then come together in moments of solidarity and we, do our solidarity thing and then go back to our own struggles, but rather those struggles are inherently intertwined from the get-go, from the beginning of the modern colonial world. And in recognizing then that, again, as I mentioned, the foundational myth of indigenous here, white over there, that's a myth. That's part of what distracts us then from this other ongoing, despite secularism, despite presumptions to secularism now, the underlying war that has been ongoing, that has these two new fronts as part and parcel of the same war. And if we then recognize that and we go to Spain, we go to Europe, we can understand that the resistance is there. So, and I come from the border. I grew up 10 blocks from the border. I grew up Border Patrol harassing us, elementary school, Border Patrol running through our playground, like chasing people who look like me. For me, I grew up hella nationalist. The lines were drawn, at least back then, all Border Patrol were white, and they were all stopping all brown people. So even coming out of that nationalist formation early on in my childhood, it became very easy then to think, anything Spain, anything Europe is white and therefore colonizer. And in essence, I think part of the Zapatistas going to Spain to illuminate this conversation was also a lesson back to even many of us on this continent who have accepted that foundational myth and say, why am I going to engage Spain? Why am I going to engage white people? And even, to go back to the previous question on ceremony, some of us might think, well, ceremony, I don't know about that. It's not my thing. I'm not religious. I'm not spiritual, or that's for indigenous. I'm not indigenous. It also ultimately foregrounds that we are all indigenous from somewhere, that we are all at one point had that connection to the land, had that correct connection to spirit, whatever that may have looked like in our own geographies. But part of the modern colonial world is precisely that separation from the connection to the land, right? And again, this is not a flimsy cosmopolitanism of, oh, we're all indigenous. No, on the contrary, it's an inversion of recognizing that indigenous is not about a biological category, but a category of colonization, right? Because indigenous peoples in the Americas were not indigenous, right? They were Odom, Chumash, Dene, and multitude of others, nations, and only in the first instance become indigenized, meaning they enter into that colonial relationship. So I think we also have to begin to, try to unsettle some of these categories that we take for granted. And the Zapatista trip to Europe, I think, in essence, also is part of that process of helping us unstabilize these categories that we've taken for granted for so long, even in the context of us presumably engaging in resistance, right? Yet we've naturalized some of the categories from which we operate. So I think that's, among others, the compas who share these reflections here, mostly who are Chicano and indigenous, are also reflecting on that. What I see is a love-hate relationship with Europe. I go to Europe every summer. I've been doing that for over 10 years for these programs, and I have a love-hate relationship because it's impossible to forget that everything that is Europe now is built on the backs of Africa, is built on the backs of this continent. And they don't have to think about that, but it's always sitting with us, right? But at the same time, the Zapatista said, we're not coming here to ask for to insist on you to ¿cómo se dice? Perdonarlos, forgiveness, or to demand an apology. We don't care for an apology. We care for thinking about the resistances even within the other Europe, and all of us building together to ultimately bring down the mal gobierno and to create a different type of world. So I think some of these report backs here give a little bit of a glimpse into that I say even contentious self-reflection of those that were on that trip accompanying the Zapatistas.
Mhm. Yeah, and then talking about what this other world is. Yeah, it's something that became so much clearer to me. Like the Zapatistas in the, since the Sixth Declaration forward, and even before, but it's been quite prominent since, have proposed that, hey, maybe it's so hard to change the world, and maybe it's difficult. It's so difficult that it's impossible. What if we just create another one? This time, a world where many worlds fit, which is, it's really nice that they're that specific, because previously we had the choice of two worlds. It was going to be NATO and it was going to be the USSR. And you had to pick one. And this is why the third world, the non-aligned movement, created itself, but then we're subsumed into it, right? And then after the Soviet Union falls, it's the imposition of one world. And so a world where many worlds fit, going to Granada made me see how this has been a project for quite a while, the one world, where there's just one way of being and you can't be different. And so there's a homogenization, and it begins within Europe and then is imposed on the rest of us.
Yeah, I think so. Spain in particular, in expelling Muslims and Jews, and I will take one slight issue, it's not African Muslims. Many indigenous Iberian peoples were Muslim too, right? And they essentially converted back to Christianity to hide. But it's not just Islam coming in from Africa and it's an African thing. There was many people in the Iberian Peninsula who themselves converted to Islam over multiple centuries. And there's a wonderful book by Miguel Olage called the Muslims Never Invaded Europe. That's the French title. In Spanish, he insisted that it be published under the title Islamic Revolution in the West, right? Because the first version was published in French under Muslims Never Invaded Europe, which is his argument, but he wanted to capture more than that it was original peoples of the Iberian Peninsula that converted to Islam over the course of 7-8 centuries, as opposed to just Africans coming North Africans, bringing that from outside, right? Because that's already feeding into the myth of reconquest, as if there ever was one unified Spain, right? So again, Olage, among others, are part of this broader rethinking that we need to do of all these categories we take for granted. But in the spirit of that one world where many world fits, as well as the interest of time, I really want to maybe as much Kiki and I, we could go at it for a long time, and we always have these very generative conversations. But really, I want to maybe shift gears here and open the floor to all of you, and what brought you here, and any questions, comments, thoughts you all might have.
Yeah, and can we take the microphone over? Yay.
And thank you for bearing with us.
Hi, thank you so much for this talk, by the way. This is really fascinating. I was wondering if you could talk about some of the similarities and contradictions of Zapatismo and what we're seeing in the Rojava revolution in Kurdistan right now, and talking about Abdullah Öcalan's sort of influence on Latin American ideological radicalism.
This is another Grietas member, and I'll pass it to her to share about that.
Hi, thanks for this great question. And I haven't had a chance to read the journal yet, but finals and grading papers. But I was pleasantly surprised to see a mention to Rojava in the piece that the Sunset Park folks wrote. So yeah, there's definitely, there are definitely a lot of connections, and I'm sure you guys also know about them. And in terms of Abdullah Öcalan in particular, and this new paradigm, this body of theory that he calls democratic confederalism that he has developed in the last 2 decades, or 3 now. There are obvious parallels to how the Zapatistas have been organizing since the 90s. And I actually was looking for any proof that he, for the ways that he was directly inspired. And people usually sort of admit that, yeah, he must have been inspired by the Zapatistas because the parallels are so strong, even though, I personally haven't found, any reference yet that he specifically read something from them, from this, so read any of the statements that have been produced by the Zapatistas. Right now, the Kurdish movement in Rojava and beyond, it's a transnational movement. They are actively building connections to the Zapatistas. Over the last years, they have been sending representatives to Chiapas to events organized by the Zapatistas with solidarity messages, and sort of actively engaging in a dialogue with the Zapatista folks on the ground. And in this trip that took place last year, they met with the representatives of the Kurdish movement in Europe. So I think both sides are actively seeking to make connections and engage in a dialogue. And definitely there are a lot of similarities in terms of direct democratic vision of how to do politics through this local neighborhood assemblies, which the Kurdish movement is currently trying to do in Rojava, as I'm sure you know. Women's emancipation being one of the core aspects of this vision, sort of developing ecological consciousness and sort of trying to recuperate indigenous traditions, even though the Kurds are normally not thought of as indigenous. And I'm glad you talk about, we are all from somewhere. And so they're also trying to recuperate spirituality and spiritual traditions that have still remained, among the elders of their communities. So definitely, a very, very good topic to explore and see all the parallels between the two movements. Thank you so much.
I'll just add 2 quick points, which is one is in the critique, right? In the analysis or the diagnosis of the extent of the problem. And what I mean by that is thinking in terms not just of, for example, as I shared earlier with the story of the coffee, capitalismo on the one hand, or racismo, global white supremacy, patriarchy, or whichever one of these various isms on their own terms, but rather what I would say and what the Zapatistas say is the idea that what we're actually dealing with is a civilizational problem, right? We have a civilization of death that is essentially the modus operandi of our current modern colonial world. And this civilization of death is a civilizational package. It's not just about capitalism that then creates sexist, patriarchal relations or racist relations as a way to sustain itself, but rather that is a civilizational package as a whole. So we have a civilization that happens to have an economic system that's capitalist, and not a capitalist civilization that then determines everything else. And the point of this is to say, it's not just, before I get called out as being anti-Marxist, as has happened in other spaces, is that, of course, it's capitalism, but it's not just capitalism. Of course, it's sexism, patriarchy, heteropatriarchy. Of course, it's racism, but not just any one of those things. What we're confronting is a civilizational whole. What the Zapatistas say is a civilization of death. And so then the question becomes, that's the similarity part, I think, in their analysis in terms of critiquing what is wrongly called Western civilization, right, which is neither Western nor civil, but rather that's the critique part. Now, the difference, I think, is then in what comes next. What's the world we build, or the many worlds we build, right? I think that's where, not that there's contradictions or divides, but I think differences in the types of world or worlds we want to build, and that's okay. At least from the Zapatista lens, that's okay, because that would fit precisely with the idea of one world where many worlds fit. Now, the democratic confederalism, I won't speak to that too much because I'm only beginning to learn a bit more about what is being proposed there. But that's where, there's differences of what's being proposed. Are they reconcilable differences? I don't think they necessarily are, but I think that's precisely the type of conversation we need to be having.
Any other question?
You've all spoken pretty beautifully. I'm going to say that, but actually,
It's because we're doing also not a live thing, but definitely a recording. So if you don't mind, just for the recording. Thank you.
So you answered part of my first question. It's a two-part. The first one: what are the challenges that this autonomous community has faced, like in terms of like fighting off capitalist thought, the monetary system, dealing with it within its own people? And then the second question is, what lessons have you learned, and what could you offer to folks that are in like urban settings like this one?
Sure, and also any other grietas, please, because this is a general Q&A. For the first part about what are obstacles that the Zapatistas face, and there's several, and a really important one is that they come under attack quite a bit, and we don't hear about it. And these are paramilitary attacks, and sadly, it's other indigenous peoples who are funded to do it. And it serves the Mexican government very well, because then it just looks like, oh, it's just these brown people killing each other. And a prehistory of that is that when the Zapatistas had the uprising against the Mexican government in 1994, it wasn't just against the Mexican government, it was against this whole package of the North American Free Trade Agreement, which is the bigger package of the civilization of death. They entered into dialogues with the Mexican government and had a ceasefire in response to civil society calling for a ceasefire. They didn't want it to turn into a Colombia or to a Guatemala. That was like, this endless civil war. And because they were in dialogue with the Mexican government is not allowed to shoot at them. And because the Mexican government is signatory to ILO 169, it's international law that says that signatory states need to allow indigenous peoples their autonomy. The Zapatistas deploy that. They don't believe that law is going to give them their autonomy at all. They build their autonomy, but that law is an obstacle that makes it harder for the Mexican government to so blatantly attack them. And of course, the government then re-strategizes and uses paramilitaries. And it's not just, the Mexican government, not like just as a nation state that's isolated, it's part of a global economic system that it has to answer to. And so they're just administering that system like nation states do, is they're administrators of this global capital, of global capitalism. And so they need to allow a good business climate to exist in a country. And so they reduce social spending, like spending for health, spending for education, for example. And then what they do is they fortify the security state that makes it so that it is safe for private property to be implemented and to be respected by force, if not by just acceptance. So so the paramilitary attacks are very frequent, and they're heightening, and yet, like Daisy was saying, the Zapatistas continue to grow, yet they're under these attacks quite a bit. That's a major obstacle that they face. And another is counterinsurgency. Counterinsurgency being, winning the hearts and minds, not through direct violence, but through capture, by government programs that say, well, we'll build a school, you don't need to organize, or, here's the handout, you don't need to, and a lot of the time, that makes it so that folks who accept those handouts and those government programs no longer organize. And then what happens is, because these handouts a lot of the time come during the presidential campaigns, the elections every 6 years, after the election's over, then there is no staffed clinic, there are no more handouts, and then people have abandoned the struggle, and now they don't, they're so dependent. And so counterinsurgency is a major obstacle as well, together with these paramilitary attacks. And as far as your second question, just very briefly, something I've personally learned that has stunned me, and I shared it earlier, we're over at the Woodbine Symbiosis Encounter over in Queens today, and tomorrow we'll talk more with the Rojava, Emergency Committee for Rojava, and us about, if you want to know, and Anya and I will be on that panel. But something that I shared this morning there is, we were talking about autonomy. The Zapatistas in 2013, they invited the world to come visit their bases of support. Normally, when we visit Zapatista territory, we're interacting with the military, with the army, the Zapatista Army of National Liberation. This was an opportunity for us to interact directly with the bases of support, everyday life. What does autonomy look like in everyday life? And we got to live in community for a few days. And they provided everything for us. They provided our food, our shelter, our water, our hygiene. They had, everything provided. They themselves had created after all these years by taking back land, which is key, through an uprising. It's not just they just didn't get no land donated, right? Or funders giving them, they struggled for that. And as I was realizing, I'm getting all of this from them, and I started to map in my head where my own food comes from, where my water, where my electricity, where my shelter, where my sense of security. And I was like, I am anti-capitalist, but I don't know how to live without capitalism. I have to pay for everything, right? I don't know how to generate it. And it was just this light bulb moment in me, in that lived experience that made me realize, which I knew in theory, but it's something about feeling it, how material so much of this is. It's not just theoretical, it's not just psychological, it's not just emotional. It's incredibly material. And as I was describing, this entire journal was produced without money except for the printing part. The printing part is the material part. We don't control the means of production in that way, right? And so it's little baby steps toward that. But it was a big realization to me in how it got so concrete, how my everyday life is so captured by capital, and so then organizing then means how to become less and less dependent on that system. And it's so hard. I don't know if it's even possible to do it individually unless you go live in a cabin in the woods or something. But as collective, worlds are built collectively. Societies are collectives. They're not just individual creations, right? And so in order to be able to escape that capture from empire, from capital, from the civilization of death, there needs to be another place to go to that then can be built stronger and stronger and stronger to be able to no longer need this dominant world so much, or make it less and less relevant to our lives. This has been one of the major realizations for me. I don't know if there are other Grietas members.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, and I think this is really important as a healer and a medic who's worked directly with compas, survivors of attacks, the compas from El CIPOC who witnessed 8 of their compañeros be massacred, and then seeing them right after that, seeing that trauma, and seeing what happens in the first year of the AMLO presidency, who's this fake progressive, right? In the US, I've heard him from leftist groups, they really think he's revolutionary. He's not, right? So in the first year of AMLO's year, we had our compañero Samir Flores murdered, right? So when we think of challenges, we also have to remember that the CNI, the SIG, ETA, they are guardianes del planeta, and at the end of the day, they're putting their bodies on the line. And it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, though, that collective strength that you get from spirituality that gives the community so much strength to continue to fight. But I just wanted to mention that as an obstacle. When we were in Clinica, another thing to point out in the point of what Kiki was saying, when practicing health and medicine in New York, I lead a team of public health educators, in the Bronx, but I mean, just the Bronx in general, we know that what the Bronx looked like compared to a gentrified community like Park Slope during the pandemic, right? And en esta civilización de muerte, el capitalismo y todas estas cosas that we see in the belly of the beast in New York, the fact that there isn't access to a community clinic, una casa de salud. In Caracol 10, where we were given this Salvador because the community has really strong faith. They have La Virgen de Maria with her paliacate, right? She's still Zapatista. But they're so spiritual and so resilient. They're currently under siege. There's a petition right now that we're sharing on our IG and our website, and we encourage everyone to sign it because they're under attack. But we were giving this beautiful Salvador in front of Casa de Salud, Floreciendo Vida Sana, flourishing a healthy life. It's made out of wood. It's small. It's got medicine though. There's access. There's access to promotores de salud, health promoters, and that's just the Casa de Salud. There's in Caracol de Morea, there's the actual hospital and there's clinics. So you have hospital where you get training, clinics, and Casas de Salud in what we would consider our neighborhood. We don't have access like that in this country, right? We definitely don't have that in the Bronx, right? And so there's so many lessons to learn. And again, I get that a lot of folks, I think until you're in the Caracol, you get to feel it the way that Kiki describes it when you're going into Caracol de Morelia and you see La Montaña, ese talén, and you see a compañera miliciana with her bow and arrow, and then it's just like, it's real, right? It's something tangible. And then going back to lessons and what it looks like in an urban space, being that I know New York and being that I'm here with the compañera, Patti, they're actively, the CNI and the ECLN offer many lessons and examples on how to organize successfully in collective around Mexico against mega projects, right? And a lot of those corporations their headquarters are based here in New York City, right? Constellation Brands, yeah, extracting water and all that. And then I think it's important because I know right now there's organizing in Brooklyn against the Brooklyn pipeline. And I think, again, we have to remember that it's important to not get distracted, because again, New York City, I know, and I say this with love, I feel like there's a lot of distraction, and sometimes we forget the enemy, right, and the oppressor, and the fact that all these corporations and mega projects, they're based out of New York City, so how do we get to a point where we can do restorative justice, right? And the compas show us, they give us an example of how to do restorative justice and listen to each other and not just cancel people out, because again, or groups or collectives, defamation, CNI, ECLN, Mexico, tons of defamation going on all the time. That's another big obstacle, misinformation. But it happens here, right? It happens in our own spaces where rather than coming together and listening to each other and figuring out, proposing solutions or building, we end up destroying or burning out, right? So I think the ECLN especially gives a lot of good examples on restorative justice. And I think that's really important in a space like New York City. And again, when we're thinking about the mega projects that we are starting to organize against in New York, we can look at the examples of the CNI and the ECLN on how they're doing it, especially with the Tren Maya and so many things that are going right now under this presidency that we don't hear enough about. And the Tren Maya funded by Goldman Sachs, or just a lot of headquarters that are, and I think it's the same. They're the same folks that are funding this. It's all connected, right? In Canada, US, Chase Bank, yeah. So I just wanted to add those things. Thank you.
So just one super quick thing on that, especially that second part of the question, and something that we haven't really discussed here at all. And that's on the back of the journal are the 7 principles del Mandato Obedeciendo. And they're also here on the coat rack. And these 7 principles of the Zapatistas and of the CNI, I think are, very short, very spiffy little statements that at first glance can seem very basic, but especially when it comes to the question of organizing Zapatistically, I don't know how you would say that, in an urban context, is I would say I would invite folks to read these seven principios and really tackle what they might mean in our context, to take those seriously, and knowing also, like, with the generosity to ourselves, that it's not an easy process, and it's a slow process to hash it out, to really figure out what these principles mean for us in our own geographies. And I think that that's really a useful strategy, that's been useful for us as our networks and our own respective organizations. And there is, I want to quick plug, I know dissertations hardly get read, but there's an amazing dissertation by Pablo Gonzalez on urban Zapatismo, looking at a few different examples of South Central farms in LA, looking at what was once called Estación Libre, which were delegations of people of color going down to Chiapas, and among other examples. And the very last thing is, one of the many, I would say, early Zapatistas I met, was always an inspiration to me personally, was Betita Martinez, who passed away not too long ago. Betita would say, dismiss nothing, romanticize nothing. And I say that in that sometimes when we engage Zapatismo, there is a romanticizing that happens, right? So I also want to caution against that, because it's not easy. It's about, that slow, steady work, like that caracol, right? Lento pero seguro. And another important lesson from Betita was also, remember something ancient, create something new, right? And it's never an either or in both cases.
So everyone, I know we're running up on time. I know we could be here for much longer. But before, as our closing, and we want to save a little bit of time for folks to continue to chat with us. I wanted to shout out just the other Grietas members who are here, who weren't participating in the panel, but like Scott, Cristina, we already heard from Anya, Isabella. Like, these are folks who are in ITSE and all of in the city, and would love to connect with folks. And like, you don't have to be, we're all in different processes of learning about Zapatismo, how to take those lessons to our organizing spaces. And so we'd love to be in conversation and dialogue with folks. Yeah, we're gonna go into the closing. We're gonna show a short, a video that was produced by Semillas Collective, that talks about the 7 principios. And then we're gonna do a closing with ITSE. But before we do ITSE and Gabo, but before that, I just want to give a shout out to the People's Forum. Thank you for hosting us, for the tech support and everything, for the beautiful space. So like, really, really appreciate it. And so if we could cue up the video, and maybe Daisy, you want to say just a few words about it.
So this is just an example of what we were working on during the Trump administration. There was a lot of trauma and hate, and we wanted to think about how do we bring together a protest dance film that's strategic and connects healing, art, and decolonizing. So it features indigenous Mexica danza. The contemporary dancers are wearing red dresses to represent missing an indigenous woman, and it's La Danza de Maíz, which is a Mexica danza. But the storyline and everything was built on the 7 principles, where we had children of quote unquote migrant or displaced indigenous people living in New York, mostly Mexican and also from Ecuador. Sister Patti was a co-director in the project. We did it at Mayday Space. And we've been working on that. Just recently, we were in Sunset Park after the attack, and we did that. What you see over there, the children of Sunset Park did art representing or describing the 7 principles. So the children in the film had to kind of learn this concept of what it means to build consensus, to propose and not impose, but the deeper conversation of what it means to be, to reclaim your indigenous roots, to be proud of wearing your indigenous feathers, your atuendo, right? And you see that in the film, and the life cycle of a semilla, and that we take our seeds wherever we go, and the message of Marichuy, que vamos a florecer, that we're gonna continue to flourish. And so So yeah, I hope you all enjoyed it. It's just a little example of a project, a beautiful project made with love, also autonomous, like all community coming together. And it's, injecting Zapatismo here in Brooklyn with the children of New York City. Thank you. It's called Papalot Muyus, which means butterfly seed.